Foreign Affairs Minister Minister Freeland is demanding the release of 2 Canadians being held in China. It's just the latest in a series of developments that began earlier this month. So here's a quick reminder of how we got here. The diplomatic feud began on December 1st when Canada arrested Meng Wanzhou. She is the chief financial officer of Chinese telecom giant Huawei. Her arrest came at the request of the United States, which accuses her of fraud. She is free on bail pending the outcome of an extradition proceeding. Now, since Meng's arrest, at least 3 Canadians have been detained in China. Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor are both accused of national security violations. However, some wonder if China arrested the men as retaliation. Now, the 3rd Canadian detained, Sarah McIver, was taken into custody earlier this week. However, both sides insist her detention is unrelated to the cases of Kovrig and Spavor. All right, so how much of an impact will Minister Freeland's demand have? We've reached out to Paul Evans for his opinion on this matter. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Wonderful to be with you.
So first of all, when we see this tougher language that's being used by Minister Freeland, by the Minister of Foreign Affairs, what impact do we think that might have when it comes to interacting with China and perhaps actions from that country?
Well, when Minister Freeland was speaking to several audiences with her comments, which did ramp up the rhetoric, the level of concern. For Canadians, that's a welcome and soothing message, indicating the government is doing everything it can in this case. For the Chinese, I doubt this is going to have a major impact. From their perspective, this is not exclusively or even primarily a rule of law issue, but is a political issue. They feel they are the aggrieved party and that a Chinese woman, a high official in a company, was they don't use the words detained, but arrested. So I don't think it's going to have, China will take note, but I doubt it's going to have a big impact. And to be accurate, this is only words. This is not an escalation, other kinds of Canadian pressure tactics, except speaking to our allies, which is a pretty low risk and not unusual step.
So what are the other options in terms of steps that Canada can take to deal with this situation? We've seen the rhetoric or the communication sort of ramp up with that language. You know, and the U.S. has certainly come to the defense of Canada, suggesting that, you know, these Canadians who are detained should also be released. What else can Canada do to find out why this happened and secure the release of the Canadians?
Well, there'll be a lot of probing going on in Beijing about the specific charges against the Canadians, the kind of things that are put in place in many instances when Canadians are arrested in or detained in other countries. So that's not unusual. I think the tough reality is that the release of those individuals is very closely tied to what happens with Madam Meng here in Vancouver. In the hearings start next month, and that until something is worked out around Madam Meng, it can be just playing through the normal courts system, our judicial system. But I think that where this issue is ultimately going to be settled, it is a political matter, not just a rule of law issue. And in that case, this is a U.S.-China matter. So the kinds of negotiations and backdoor discussions over the next month that do include the United States, that include Canada and China on what might be outcomes. President Trump has already underlined how this is tied into the bigger picture of U.S.-China relations. So I think it's in that triangle that the problem lies, but that maybe some kind of solution to the Meng affair may come through.
And just finally, on the point of how the Canadians who are detained may be treated, we have heard a little bit about the conditions under which Michael Kovrig is being held, and then we know that China is downplaying those reports. How grave could the situation for the Canadians who are detained be at this stage?
Well, from what we see in the public coverage on this, the treatment of the 2 Michaels is probably not very pleasant. but it is in keeping with Chinese standard practice. Our rules, our sense of how you treat detainees, how you question people when they have access to lawyers and other things. We have two different kinds of justice systems that are in play. So my heart goes out to Mr. Kovrig and Mr. Spaver, who I know both of them. And I hope that they are faring well under what are probably routine Chinese conditions. If we get any sense that they're escalated in any way, then that means we're going to have to respond even more strongly at the rhetorical level and maybe look at some actions against China. But we're not there yet. And I'm hoping that we can have a Christmas truce to calm things down and see how we can get things to work positively come January when the Hmong case is back in the courts.
Well, we'll have to see if your idea of a Christmas truce is actually what ends up developing down the road. We'll continue to track the situation, as I'm sure you will too. Thank you again for joining us, Professor Evans.
My pleasure being with you.
That was Paul Evans, and he is with the Institute of Asian Research, and he spoke to us from Vancouver. We'll be back in just a moment.